Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We are picking up in where we left off, talking about the captivity in our previous episode, and you'll probably be happy to know this. This is actually our last official discussion, quote unquote, about the history of the Old Testament. That's not because there's not more we could talk about from the history of the Old Testament, but that's simply because of the fact that as we're coming to the end of the historical portion of our study, we have some other issues we want to look at from the Old Testament that I believe are important for us to understand. So we're not just going to look at the historical details like we have up to this point, but we're going to turn our attention to some other issues that come up in the Old Testament about who God is and about his nature and about so many other things that are very deep in the Old Testament that we don't always think about beyond the historical details. So this conversation will be the final one that we have officially about the historical section of the Old Testament, although I'm sure throughout the remainder of our study this year, we have a lot more we're going to talk about relevant to that. But going back to our previous episode when we talked about the captivity and God's promise to return his people home from captivity, we want to pick up where we left off there. And so in our previous episode, it was pretty hopeful. At least from my perspective, it was hopeful. Hopefully it was from yours too. But we see in that hope that God said that his people had a future. They had something to look forward to. They would come home. They would rebuild. They would be restored to God's service. They would once again do his will. But I've got to tell you, the historical details that bear out in the Old Testament show us that was not an easy process. That did not just come automatically. It's not as though when the Persians roll in and take over Babylon and send the Jews home, that they rolled out the red carpet and just allowed them to do whatever they pleased. Obviously, they blessed them immeasurably. They gave them a lot of resources to go home with. They allowed them to go home in the first place. So those are good things. But that's to say, it's not as though they were just given everything on a silver spoon. They still had to do some work. And to be sure, there was a lot of work to do. Remember when we talked about the fall of Judah, and really the fall of Israel too, so the two kind of go hand in hand here. But when we talk about the fall of Judah or the fall of Israel, we're not talking about the city was captured and a few of the buildings were destroyed, but mostly the place stayed intact. That's not what happened, especially not with Judah. The place was completely leveled in many respects. There were still homes that were standing, but the temple, that was gone. Most of the large structures would have been completely destroyed. The wall of Jerusalem, which in the ancient world, a walled city was very important to keep beasts of the field out, to prevent theft and other issues from taking place as a general rule. It was just a safety mechanism. And now you have the wall of Jerusalem torn down. You have a lot of damage that has to be cleared out. I mean, it's not as though when Jerusalem was besieged and destroyed by the Babylonians, they came back a year later and cleaned it all up. They had no interest in doing that. So the city remained in ruins, along with the temple, along with every other structure. When the Jews return home after the Persians send them back, they've got a lot of work to do to that end. Not only did they have to deal with rebuilding the temple and nearly every city surrounding Jerusalem, they had to deal with hostile neighbors. And to be sure, they had a lot of hostile neighbors. They had a lot of people who, when the Jews came back and wanted to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, they were not pleased by those developments. They actively mocked them. They actively tried to stop them. They threatened them on multiple occasions. It was not a good situation. They were not returning to open hearts and warm hearts. They were returning to people who hated them. And we also find that they were discouraged as a collective people. They go back home. They're trying to rebuild. They're trying to become reestablished, to be restored to God's service. And they keep having all of these setbacks and all of these challenges and all these problems. And they were, in many respects, a political backwater as far as the people themselves and as far as where they were located. It's not as though it was a strategic territory by this point. And the Persians had bigger fish to fry, so to speak, later on, that they just didn't have the attention to pay here to the Jews and to their plight. So they had helped them initially, yes, but that is to say they still had a lot of problems, and the only one who really was helping them through all of this was God. Because even through all of these challenges, we're going to see that God gave them what they needed to overcome those challenges. And to their credit, we're going to see that for the most part they did. Now, that's not to say that everything was perfect. That's not to say that the nation became exactly what God wanted it to be. But that's to say that through his power and through what he provided for them, they generally became a whole lot better than they had been before. So now that we have a good handle on the problem that was taking place in Judah when they got back from the captivity, I think we can actually get into some further details that help us understand why they had such a problem recovering from the captivity. So we find, first and foremost, we want to make sure we emphasize this, that God empowered a lot of people to help the Jews recover from captivity. So God is going to empower leaders, specifically, and prophets, we're going to talk about them in just a moment, to help his people to become who he wanted them to be and to really encourage them to stand up and do what needed to be done. Because again, as we mentioned about the return back from captivity and dealing with the rebuilding, dealing with hostile neighbors, dealing with discouragement, they really were not in a good position to do what needed to be done. They were not in a happy mood, in other words. And so they needed some encouragement and some help to be able to do that. And so God is going to empower prophets in this particular time after the captivity, like Haggai and Zechariah. So we actually have their books that are recorded in the Old Testament. We'll talk probably in further detail about those prophetic books later. But you have the books of Haggai and Zechariah, but those were prophets in this period of time after the captivity. And their job and their role from God was to stir the people up. Haggai specifically condemns the people in Haggai chapter 1, talking about how they were eager to rebuild their own homes, but they were content to leave the temple in ruins. And he mentioned to them that was not God's will. And that was the reason they were having some other struggles that were related to the fact of their attitude and the problems they were suffering as a result of that. You find with Zechariah that although when we read his prophecy today, it's a bit obscure to us and we don't always connect the dots and the details, would have been really important for them to understand. And I'm sure that they needed some explanation of what he was talking about, but his message is quite powerful when you think about the situation these people found themselves in. So between Haggai and Zechariah, you have two prophets who are stirring the people up, provoking them to do better, telling them what God wanted them to do. And I'll mention that this was one of the first times that they had had prophets in their midst for a long time. Not necessarily centuries, but certainly decades. Because you remember that you have prophets like Daniel who were in captivity, yes, but we don't necessarily get the impression that he was out there publicly preaching. And Ezekiel did a little bit, but we're not sure how long he lived after the captivity, and we don't know much about what happened to Jeremiah after the captivity either. So Haggai and Zechariah are going to be some of the first prophets that have arrived on the scene, and they're going to make a big impact in the nation's life and in the hearts of the people. And they're going to really get the nation back on track. And then you have two others that God is going to empower to lead his people to do what needs to be done, and that's going to be Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And yes, that's actually Zerubbabel, that's his real name. That's not just something I made up, nor is it something someone else made up. So Zerubbabel and Jeshua are going to be those who are leading this effort to rebuild the temple. And they're going to play a significant role in that. And actually, if you read through Haggai and Zechariah, you're going to find out some more detail concerning them and their efforts to do what needed to be done. And ultimately, especially from like Zechariah chapters 3 and 4, you find out very quickly how God saw these two men, Zerubbabel and Jeshua, and what he wanted them to accomplish. And that's exactly what they're going to do. So in Ezra chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, you can read about the prophets Haggai and Zechariah and what they did, and you can also read about Zerubbabel and Jeshua and what they were doing among the people as well. Now we find out through their efforts, so through the leadership of the prophets and through the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, we find that God's people are able to rebuild the temple. And it's going to cause great rejoicing among the people as a result. So the joy that the captivity in many respects took away from the people, and to be sure, it was because of their sin, so it was not as though it was imposed upon them, but it was because of their sin this happened. But that joy that had been taken away is now going to come back. And I'm actually going to have us read in Ezra chapter 6 here, verses 14 through 22, so basically just the latter part of that chapter, because I think this is an important lesson for us to think about as far as the joy these people have as part of the restoration and as part of this recovery. And all of it being done because God was enabling people to accomplish this on their behalf. So let's dig into Ezra chapter 6 here together. Again, we're looking at verses 14 through 22. And we'll just go ahead and read this now. There's some interesting names in here. We've already seen one of them, Zerubbabel, but we're going to talk about some others here as we go through this as well. So just bear with me. So beginning in Ezra chapter 6 and verse 14, we read this. So the elders of the Jews built, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they built and finished it, according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the command of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Now the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the descendants of the captivity, celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. And they offered sacrifices at the dedication of this house of God, 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They assigned the priests to their divisions and the Levites to their divisions, over the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. And the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, All of them were ritually clean. And they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren the priests, and for themselves. Then the children of Israel, who had returned from the captivity, ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the Lord God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them, to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So we're really seeing a summary of what we said up to this point. So go back up to verse 14 with me for just a moment. So the elders of the Jews build, along with all the nation, that's basically what's encompassed there, and they prosper through the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. They build and they finish the temple according to God's command and according to the command of the kings of Persia, so that's a rare occasion where you have secular kings, so to speak, whose command actually aligns with God. So they finish the temple, and you notice that joy fills this section from verse 16 onward. And that joy is manifested through worship. So you're seeing them offer sacrifices to dedicate the house of God. You see them getting back to observing the Passover there in verse 19. So it's details like that to tell us that there was a great amount of joy during this period, that they really were enjoying the restoration that God had blessed them with. The fact that they were back in their homeland, the fact that they were allowed to rebuild the temple, they're overjoyed at this. And it's so wonderful to read a section like this. It's a rare moment of victory for the people of God. And again, to be clear about that, it's not that the victories are few and far between because God doesn't let them be more common. It's because the people themselves do not align with him, and thus they have a lot of struggles. But that is to say that in this moment and in this time, we're seeing a great success and a great victory. And that is indeed a wonderful thing. And you're really seeing the joy of restoration, the joy of recovery from a bad situation, and the appreciation they have for this. That does not mean it's going to last. We always have to add that caveat whenever we talk about this, because we don't want to portray it as though everything was just a happy ending after this. But that is to say that because of what God did for his people in this moment, at this time, in what we just read, we're seeing a great deal of joy. And that is something for which we can be thankful. So going back to our slideshow, we see that through God's divine providence, look at what he was able to accomplish. Look at what he was able to do for his people, to take all the bad that they had experienced, even after the captivity, dealing with persecution from hostile neighbors, dealing with rebuilding, dealing with discouragement. He was able, through his power, and through what he did through Zerubbabel and Jeshua and Haggai and Zechariah, to overcome those challenges and to help his people be even stronger as a result. Now, that does not mean that was all that he did. So the story of the recovery from captivity does not end in Ezra chapter 6. Because if you look at the book of Ezra, and this is just one detail about that specific book, that book is kind of divided into two sections. So chapters 1 through 6 detail the initial return from captivity, where they rebuild the temple, and that's what we just talked about. But then chapters 7 onward deal with actually a period of time afterward. So we're dealing with maybe a couple of decades, maybe even 3 decades later, where now you're dealing with a different situation. So the people of God are still recovering from captivity. So it's still encompassed in this conversation. It's just a few decades after the temple is rebuilt, and they have some other problems that arise as a result. So like I said, it was not as though it was all sunshine and rainbows once the temple was rebuilt. They still had some issues. One of those issues was the fact that a lot of the people of God were frankly ignorant of God's laws and what he expected of them. They understood that they were his people, they understood he had expectations, but what those were was a bit unclear. They needed someone to teach them. And on top of that, they had another problem. Zerubbabel and Jeshua by this point were gone. They likely had passed away, but maybe something else came up and took them away from the people of Israel, or people of Judah. And so they're no longer available. They're no longer there. And so you have a leadership vacuum where there's another governor that rises up, and I believe he is Jewish, but he's not really that hands-on of a leader. He's not someone that is really respectable in that position. So you have a leadership vacuum. And whenever a leadership vacuum emerges like that, it's almost always going to be disastrous for the people who are trying to do better. And so you have Nehemiah, who's going to come on the scene, who really is not the person you'd expect to be a leader, and yet he's going to fill that role well and help the people of God overcome other challenges they were facing that no one else had really addressed up to that point. So with that in mind, let's just take a look at these two men, and just one passage for each of them. And that's to say there's a whole lot more complexity to these people, to Ezra and Nehemiah, that we could talk about. You know me quite well with Nehemiah, that I could have an entire episode dedicated to him, but I'll spare you that for now. But let's just read a couple of passages that I think really summarize who these men are and help us to understand where their priorities were. So we're going to look at Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10 in just a moment here. So Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10. I'll invite you to join me in the reading here of Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10. It's a real quick verse. For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel. There's a lot that's packed into that simple statement. So Ezra prepares his heart to seek God's law, to practice it himself, and to teach the statutes and ordinances of the law to others in Israel. So here's a person who's taking seriously his charge as a priest of God to teach the people of God. He really wants to do this. It's not just something that he is obligated to do. It's something he wants to do. And that's commendable. That's what the people needed, was that information about God's law and his expectations, so they could continue the recovery from captivity and understand to avoid idolatry and the sins that accompany idolatry and all the other things that the law forbade. They needed someone to teach them those things. They weren't just going to figure it out for themselves. And that's what Ezra is going to do. He's going to return from Persia. He's going to return in a second wave after the captivity. He's going to arrive, and he's going to teach the people of God what needs to be heard. Then we also find with Nehemiah here in chapter 2 and verses 16 through 18, another detail about him. Now understand again, this is just one passage that just briefly tells us one thing about Nehemiah, but it's something that I think stands out about him and helps us really understand who he was as a person. So let's go back into the text here. We're going over to Nehemiah chapter 2 and verses 16 through 18, and let's read that together. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of God which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, Let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. Now, as you can probably tell from my highlighting, this is a favorite section of Scripture for me. And you might be scratching your head at why I say this summarizes Nehemiah as a person. But I think you see a lot of things about Nehemiah in this brief section. So first of all, you see in verse 16 a detail that may not immediately stand out to you, but in verse 16, you're seeing that this is a man who wanted to have a plan, and someone who understood the value of a plan, and was not flashy about it. He didn't come back to Jerusalem from Persia because he had been the cupbearer of the Persian king, which was a pretty prominent position to be in. But here he is. He didn't have to come back to do this. He wanted to do this to help his people, and he wasn't doing this for showmanship. He did not do this because he wanted the acclaim and the favor that came with it. He was doing this because he genuinely wanted to help. He did not tell anybody what was going on yet because he wanted to formulate a plan. And then he wanted to present that to the people for their consideration. And that's what you see in verse 17. He talks there of the distress the people are in and how Jerusalem lie in waste and how its gates are burned with fire. They need to rebuild the wall. So he gives a problem, but he also gives a solution, and he gives them a motivation for this. He says in verse 17 that we may no longer be a reproach. He is concerned about their situation. He realizes this is not how God intends it to be. He tells in verse 18 of what God had done through him and for him. So he's reminding them of the fact that God is the one who is blessing them all the way through, and how God was the one who was changing even the king's heart to help the people of God. And so you see at the end of verse 18, they're the result of his leadership. Leadership he was showing before he was officially a leader, quote unquote. And they say, let's rise up and build. And then they set their hands to that good work. So Nehemiah was a diligent leader. He was someone who saw that there was a problem, and he rose up to do something about it. He didn't just stand idly by and say, someone else will figure this out. He understood that someone needed to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and he was the one to do it. It was hard. It was difficult work. None of this was easy, and yet he was going to be the one to do it. After centuries and decades of inaction on the part of the people, he was going to kick them into gear through his leadership. And so we're going to see with Ezra and Nehemiah with their dueling emphasis there. Ezra being a teacher of the law, helping the people understand God's expectation, and Nehemiah leading the people to God through the actions that are taking place in the land of Judah. You're seeing them be able to work in tandem. And in fact, they do have some overlap, because if you read Ezra chapter 7 through 10 and then Nehemiah, you're going to see that they interacted with each other and they were around the same time. But they had the same vision. They had the same goal in mind. It was just they had two different sides of the same coin they had to go ahead and resolve. And so you see that God empowered Ezra. He empowered Nehemiah to do these things. And I doubt very seriously that it was necessarily something with Nehemiah that he thought this would happen. And in fact, if you read the book, you'll find out that that may not have been his intended path in life. And yet God, through his providence, was able to lead Nehemiah to that point, just as he was for Ezra. And so he's going to use these men, Ezra and Nehemiah, to keep Judah on the right path. So that way they can avoid going back to idolatry and paganism, which it seems they were drifting back toward after the temple was rebuilt. And so once again, despite some of the setbacks and problems they faced, it's through the efforts of Ezra and Nehemiah that once again the people of God rejoice. They are once again in a position of joy and happiness because of what God has done for them. And we see that he was able to do this through his divine providence, taking care of his people after the captivity, helping them to rebuild, helping them to overcome persecution, and helping them to rejoice in all that he had given to them. Now, they're going to have problems after this. Even after Ezra and Nehemiah depart from the scene, they're going to have some more problems. But that's to say that God was able to help his people weather the storm. And he was there with them every step of the way, blessing them and blessing them again. But I think a couple of important lessons emerged to that end. One of them related to God and one of them related to us. One of them related to God in this respect is the fact that he is able to help his people no matter the situation they face. The captivity did a number on Judah. It did a number not only on the land but on the people. And yet God was able to help them overcome the consequences of their own actions. And he was able to give them leaders and able to give them guidance and able to give them so many good things so they could endure all of that. And they could overcome it and they could be better for it. So we see that God helps his people in these situations, that there's no difficulty or challenge that's too much for him to overcome. He is able to provide the resources. The key there being that his people lay hold of the resources. He sent them prophets like Haggai and Zechariah, for instance, back when we talked about the rebuilding of the temple. What if the people of God said, we don't really want to rebuild the temple, and they chose to do something different? Well, then that's on them. God gave them what they needed, and they chose to reject it. So we understand that's a problem, but thankfully that's not what happened in that situation. Instead, what happened was they listened to what God gave them, and they responded positively. So we are thankful for that, and thankful for the help that God gives us. The fact that he does not leave us on our own. The fact that he really does give us the resources that we need to overcome. And then one final lesson I'll mention, and then we'll go ahead and conclude for right now, is the fact that restoration is a hard process. And revival is a hard process. It is not easy to recognize within ourselves that we've drifted away and need to come back. It's not easy to recognize the difficulty of helping others to come back and to be restored. It is difficult work. You're going to face discouragement. You're going to face persecution. You're going to face all kinds of problems, and that rebuilding is going to be really difficult. But we see that the challenges and obstacles are worth the reward that comes at the end. So we see that God is there to help us. He's able to give us those resources, but it's for us to rise up and build, as it were, to do what he tells us to do, and to put in that hard work for restoration and recovery that will help us to be the best that we can be, even if our past has some issues in it that need to be resolved. So with all that being said, we will conclude there. As I mentioned, this is our last episode. We're talking about the history of Israel. And our next topic of conversation that's going to take us several weeks to get through is going to be how we see God through the Old Testament. And it might surprise you to find out that it's not all anger and wrath and destruction, but is actually a lot more akin to what we find in the New Testament. So we're going to be interested to dig into that more and understand what the Old Testament says about who God is and what his nature is. For right now, I'll leave you with that thought, and I look forward to talking with you again about these matters soon. As always, thank you for your attention, and take care.